everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rosario Hernandez. I serve as the Associate Director of Early Childhood Policy and Advocacy at the Latino Policy Forum. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. Today's webinar is hosted by the Latino Policy Forum in partnership with Illinois Action for Children, We the Village Coalition, Start Early, Raising Illinois, alongside our state agency partners, the Department of Children and Family Services, and the new Department of Early Childhood. We're really grateful for this strong collaboration and for each of you taking the time to be part of this conversation today. Before we dive in, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure that everyone can fully participate in today's webinar. So first, I'm pleased to introduce our interpreter, Roberto Mendoza, who will share instructions on how to access interpretation services so that everyone can comfortably engage in the language that they prefer. Roberto, please take it away.
Good afternoon. I will make this announcement in Spanish, and then I will go ahead and do it in English. Aquellas personas que nos sintonizan, que son de habla hispana y que prefieren escuchar este fabuloso webinario en español, quiero rogarles que busquen el icono que aparecerá pronto. And Aman, this is your cue to show the interpretation bar. Va a aparecer un globito en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla. Pueden hacer clic en dicho botoncito y al hacer clic pueden seleccionar el idioma español. Ahora bien, es opcional si desean escuchar solamente el idioma que se está interpretando o silenciar el idioma inglés, que es el idioma original. Y siempre debes unirte a la reunión usando tu computadora y todos los dispositivos que tengas a la mano. So, in a minute, we're going to see an interpretation bar which has a globe. And once you see it, please look for the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see an icon, click the More button on your screen so you can select interpretation. Chances are that there won't be many Spanish interpretation needed, but in case there's some intervention in Spanish, please do click on the English globe so that you can get the rendition in Spanish. Alrighty, with that, you're gonna see that globe in the middle, and I will disappear, and I will start broadcasting in Spanish.
Gracias, Roberto. Thank you, Roberto. So a few additional reminders. If you have any questions during the presentation, we can skip to the next slide. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature by clicking the Q&A button and typing your question there. We'll be gathering those questions and addressing them during the Q&A portion of the program. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared afterward so that you'll have an opportunity to revisit the conversation. And if you experience any technical issues, please feel free to reach out to Aman, who's been great behind the scenes, and the Illinois Action team, who are supporting us behind the scenes today. So thank you so much for joining. And before I introduce our CEO to ground us in today's conversation, we'd love to learn more about who's in the room today. So in a second, you'll see a live poll on your screen to click what your role is at the organ, where you're coming from and joining us from. And so I'll take a moment so that everyone can answer that question, and then we can see together who's in the room. Okay, we can give it one more second and then close out to see who has joined us today.
Numbers are still creeping up, but
Okay,
I'll end it in just a second.
thank you, Bree.
All think we're about good.
Great. So, seeing the poll results, we're seeing a lot of center directors. Over 40% of you are center directors, followed by advocates who account for 21%. And then we have early educators also joining us, which account for about 14%. We have some home providers, parents and caregivers, and other. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you walk away with some great information. But without further ado, it's now my pleasure to introduce the Latino Policy Forum CEO, Linda Tortolero. Linda will help ground us in today's conversation, sharing why this topic is so timely and what we hope to accomplish today in this session.
Gracias, Rosario, for passing the baton. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to all the partners today who made this webinar possible and who sponsored and advocated for HB 1312 during last year's veto session. The staff of the Latino Policy Forum is especially proud to have been part of this effort in partnership with fabulous, dedicated advocates and organizations. Amid heightened immigration enforcement efforts, HB 1312 is a critical step forward in ensuring that every young child in Illinois can learn and grow in a safe and welcoming environment. I have had the opportunity to serve on the Illinois Accountability Commission, which will create a public record of the conduct of federal agents during Operation Midway Blitz and the military-style operations throughout the Chicagoland area. The commission also will examine the impact of that conduct on individuals and communities and consider policy recommendations to prevent future harm in Illinois. I'd like to share a few reflections about our most recent commission hearing to further ground us in today's conversation. The commission and the members of the public heard important testimony from experts about the harmful effects to the mental health of children and youth whose families have been separated or fear that their parents or loved ones will be kidnapped, detained, and deported. In particular, I was very moved and concerned by the testimony that detailed the psychological harm to children due to excessive abuses of enforcement that we have experienced in Illinois. One witness explained how children and young people may feel that belonging is conditional and that self-hate can be a long-term effect when their sense of identity is threatened. We also learned how challenging it is for children to feel a sense of belonging when there is no safety. We also heard testimony about the resilience of young children and their ability to adapt and thrive, and the great importance of joy in our communities for our collective healing. Illinois' early childhood system is strongest when young children, families, and professionals feel safe in programs that they depend on each day. HB 1312 helps ensure that licensed child care centers remain trusted, stable spaces, especially during a time when heightened immigration enforcement has created fear, confusion, and barriers to access for many families. We should be proud to live in a state like Illinois, where advocates and state agencies center the safety and well-being of children and immigrant families. HB 1312 will help to strengthen our children's safety and allow them to be joyful and thrive in a nurturing learning environment. The goal of today's session is to support the childcare ecosystem, which includes licensed childcare center directors and staff, and provide greater understanding of the implementation of the new legal requirements related to immigration enforcement. This afternoon, we will cover the following: an overview of HB 1312, safe licensed childcare legislation, what the new requirements mean for licensed childcare centers, guidance on compliance and practical implementation steps from the Early Department of Children and Family Services and the Illinois Department of Early Childhood, resources and information from state agencies. On behalf of the Latino Policy Forum and the partners who helped to coordinate today's webinar, please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions about the guidance which is provided or the implementation. Now I'd like to pass the baton back to Rosario and Mercedes. Mil gracias to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So today's time will be spent diving into the buckets that you see here. We'll start off today's conversation with some background and context, how this legislation came about, the goals of HB 1312, the components of HB 1312, and then we'll hear directly from the state agency partners, as well as having a Q&A session along with toolkit and resources. And then we'll close out by sharing more about upcoming events. Next slide, please. So to continue grounding our discussion, I want to provide a bit of context for today's topic. Last year, the Latino Policy Forum, alongside partners including the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, worked on legislation focused on K-12 settings. And our goal was really to ensure that all children have access to safe, supportive, and uninterrupted learning environments, free from intimidation, that every student deserves. So today's conversation builds on that work and expands on that shared commitment. So as HB 3247 was enacted, which only applies to K-12 school settings, we began receiving many questions on how these protections apply to early childhood settings, and even in some cases, higher education settings. So being that families, providers, and advocates wanted clarity, this prompted a lot of the advocates to engage in conversations on what potential legislation could look like. And so to walk us through how this early childhood legislation unfolded, I will hand things over to Mercedes Mondragon, Senior Policy Manager at Start Early.
Thanks, Rosario. So as Rosario mentioned, my name is Mercedes Mondragon. I'm a Senior Policy Manager at Start Early. And just to give a little bit of additional context, when the new administration came in January 2025, one of the first actions that they took was to rescind the Federal Protected Areas Policy. Now, the Protected Areas Policy has been in place in some form or fashion since the Clinton years, and it has basically instructed immigration officials to exercise good judgment whenever they're going to attempt to engage in any sort of immigration enforcement activity. And this is specifically in reference to, locations where folks access critical services, right? These are the protected areas. In 2021, we actually saw the Biden administration strengthen this guidance to say that immigration enforcement activities should not occur in places where people access these essential services, right? So in places where children gather, and they specifically called out schools. So immigration enforcement activities should not happen near schools. And with the rescission of the Protected Areas Policy in January 2025, we really saw the guardrails for where immigration enforcement activities could and could not occur. We really saw those guardrails fall off. So officials started acting with much more autonomy. For those of you who live in Chicago or the surrounding suburbs or the surrounding counties, we experienced firsthand the launch of Operation Midway Blitz, which lasted approximately 4 months over the course of, last fall. And so we saw much more aggressive immigration enforcement activity, right? So we saw activity being conducted in school parking lots or outside of, schools or centers. We saw tear gas being deployed during drop-off, right? Things that had previously very much been off limits, right? Because they are places where children gather, where people access essential services. And so this really created a lot of widespread fear in communities. And as Rosario mentioned, we started to hear more and more from childcare providers around, what are some practical steps that we can take in order to make sure that our children, our families, and our staff are safe. So, the advocates on this call, so Start Early, Latino Policy Forum, Illinois Action for Children, really worked closely with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ICER, and also MALDOF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, as we started to think about how we could use the Safe Schools for All legislation as a foundation for how we tried to protect essentially like children and families and staff within 0 to 5 licensed childcare centers. So we can move to the next slide. So during veto session last year, the opportunity for HB 1312, which was a comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation that governed, several other facets, not just childcare, but we were able to use this piece of legislation to insert some of our childcare protections. And so the goals of this bill language were really twofold. One was to help providers prepare in the event of an immigration enforcement action, at a child care center. And the second goal was really to safeguard children and staff and also help inform families. So we can move to the next slide. So some of the highlights or the main components of HB 1312 are on this slide. Number one, we wanted to prohibit the sharing of information about a child or their family's immigration status, whether that status was perceived or actual. And the legislation also requires centers to establish or update any policies that they have, so children are not excluded or discouraged from attending a specific program, right? We really wanted to emphasize that all children are welcome within our early learning centers. And so some of the more specific policies that are required are that centers need to create a written plan of action for how they interact with immigration enforcement if they are to arrive at the center. So what do specific protocols look like? What's the course of action? Centers also need to designate private spaces, and this can be as simple as displaying a sign on your front door of the center which says this is a private business, only patrons may enter. But really just designating that private space is important. The legislation also requires that centers designate primary points of contact. So if immigration officials do arrive at the center, who do they talk to? And for the most part, this will probably be center directors. But in case the center director is not there at that point in time, who's essentially second in command. And then the legislation also requires emergency contacts to be updated biannually. And we felt that this was an important piece to include in the legislation because oftentimes, we'll take this information upon enrollment, so a child's emergency contacts, and then over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, it's not really something that's thought of or updated. So we wanted to make sure that emergency contacts, especially in this context that we're living in, were updated on a consistent basis. Centers are also required to notify parents or caregivers if enforcement occurs at or near a center. And this is important for a variety of reasons, but in case a parent or a caregiver cannot pick up their child because there's enforcement activity, near the center. It's important for, families in centers to stay in contact with each other so they can create alternative plans for pickup in case that's necessary. And then lastly is to update the late pickup policy, and this is already required under licensing rules. But we had been hearing from a lot of providers and also from our agency partners that they had been receiving more calls through the DCFS hotline about centers who were unsure if they could release the child to the emergency contacts or not. So that's something that we wanted to clarify in the legislation. And then lastly, HB 1312 requires our agency partners, so DCFS and IDEC, to make specific resources available. And so some of these resources that are helpful for families include know your rights information or information regarding short-term guardianship, basically anything that would be deemed important for families to have, like family preparedness training or family preparedness planning in light of the current context. So I will turn it back over to Rosario.
Thank you, Mercedes. And now I'd like to transition the conversation over to our state agency partners with this new law now in effect. They will walk us through what providers need to know, what this means in practice, to continue to uplift those safe and supportive environments for children and families. So with us today, we have Joanna Sharp, Senior Advisor to the Director of Special Projects at the Department of Children and Family Services, and Jennifer Cohen, General Counsel at the Illinois Department of Early Childhood. So thank you both for being here, and I will hand it over to you all.
Thank you, Rosario. And thanks for everyone for joining today. And thank you for Mercedes for that wonderful build up about HB 1312. So I am going to start us off because I am an attorney, and so is Joanna, doing the most lawyerly thing that we can do, which is giving a disclaimer that this presentation by Joanna and I is not intended to be specific legal advice, and that just noting if you do have a specific legal question, please reach out to your own counsel. We can go to the next slide. So Mercedes did a great job explaining the components of HB 1312. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide, but we'll just highlight it did pass in VTOL, and the requirement to have a policy on daycare centers to have a policy in place is by January 1st, 2026. And we're going to go later into this presentation and talk about the policy template that DCFS and IDEC created jointly to give providers kind of a head start on creating that policy. We can go to the next slide. And then we'll hand it over to Joanna.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanna Sharp. Thank you for having us. Sort of to level set a little bit at the beginning, and Mercedes again did a great job of sort of taking us up to this point. As sort of the immigration crisis was unfolding around Illinois, we were hearing at the state agency level a lot of fear and concern, understandably, and feeling that ourselves. And so IDEC and DCFS collaborated to create this guidance, really with two things in mind: to help families and to help providers prepare. Preparing in advance, while we cannot control, what the federal government is doing, and we cannot control what happens necessarily on that end, we can control our own actions by being prepared and planning in advance for, any of these potential situations that we're talking about can really make a critical difference for everyone involved, particularly a child's well-being. So with that in mind, we collaborated and created the two resources that you see dot pointed on this slide. They can be found on both state agency websites. What you see here is the Illinois DCFS website, and across the blue tab on the top on the left is Protecting Kids. When you go there to the purple on the left, you see Immigration Enforcement Resources for Families, and that's where all of this information, PDFs in multiple languages, can be accessed and downloaded. So I'm actually going to address these in reverse order. I'll start first with the non-regulatory guidance and then deal with a different graphic after that. Okay, next slide, please. So the name of this game is preparedness. As Mercedes was saying, this document is really intended to be a guide, and so it's important to explain what it is and what it is not. There are no new legal requirements or rules in this guidance. These are practical steps, best practices, and resources so that we can be prepared as much as possible. The guidance has three core ideas. Number one, that every child in Illinois has the right to child care. This must be provided regardless of race, color, national origin. And with respect to immigration status, that information is not required when enrolling a child in daycare. So that is key in this guidance. Number two, we talk about confidentiality, and the idea behind that, while required, is that we want to protect families' privacy. We are the stewards of some very confidential and important information, and it's not the provider's information to give out absent, a court directive or a parental consent. And the third goal is just to support families. And the best way, again, I'll be a broken record today, is to plan ahead. Having a clear plan in place, I think anyone who's been in a crisis can attest to the fact that if you have a plan, there's a chance you might use it. If you don't have a plan, there's no chance you're going to use it. So that's what we're trying to facilitate here with this guidance. Next slide, please. Okay, a key part of the non-regulatory guidance, and which is in HB 1312, is client confidentiality. Illinois statute and rules require daycare providers to information about children and their relatives confidential. It's court ordered, or there's specific consent to release the information by a parent or guardian. And when we talk about the information that's protected, we're talking about two categories: personally identifiable information and personal health information. And I'm not going to define those here today because they both have big definitions, but they're actually fairly user-friendly definitions, I would say, as far as statutes go. And I would encourage you to look them up to get a little bit more information. I don't see the citation on the slide here, but we certainly have that and can provide it. And sort of what that looks like for most centers is probably admission and discharge information, health information for a child or family, health insurance information. Those are the types of things that you're most likely to have that would be protected in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll pass this over to Jennifer for a few slides.
Thank you, Joanna. So Joanna kind of covered the guidance, the non-regulations that DCFS and IDEC worked together on a little bit prior to and while HB 1312 was being drafted and working its way through veto session. Once HB 1312 passed, DCFS and IDEC went in to collaborate again to provide the providers a policy template, so that way they had a starting point to enact HB 1312. IDEC has heard in a lot of our listening sessions that a lot of times statutes are passed or rules are promulgated, and then providers are left figuring out how to implement them themselves. So we do have so we decided to work together to create this policy template. It is on DCFS's website, and it really walks through each of the components of HB 1312 and allows providers space to go through their policy. So it allows you, talks about private spaces. It allows you to list a designee or an alternative designee. It talks about, it has space to fill out for parental consent and for procedures for interacting with immigration personnel, enforcement personnel. We can go to the next slide. So here is the screenshot of the policy template. Another thing we wanted to do was provide examples of properly executed warrants, because we understand that it's easy to say, don't release information unless you have a properly executed warrant or court order. However, it's another thing to actually be in that situation and try to figure out if something is properly executed. So at the bottom, the last page and a half, you will see that there are examples that we've embedded in the policy template. So that way the providers have something to refer to. We can go to the next slide. So how do you prepare for enforcement action at a daycare? It's incredibly important to have that point person, and I know we've covered this a lot. It's a requirement of HB 1312, but it's incredibly important to have that point person. In HB 1312, it is required to be a director or a director's designee. In the policy template, there is room for 2 alternative point people, and I think it's good to have as many people trained on this policy as possible. and trained to be that point person in case someone is out sick or something occurs where the initial designee cannot assist. Two, it's important to have clear instructions that are written and easily accessible. So if immigration enforcement comes to a center, what we want to make sure that providers can do is identify the specific request from the immigration enforcement agent and make sure that they have documents in support of that request. Remember, always keep in mind the confidentiality requirements that Joanna just spoke about. And then the other thing is it is important for providers to make sure that their staff is trained. So the designee or the point person does need to be trained, but it's really important that all staff is trained. So that way, not just in how to interact with immigration enforcement or on the policy, but also how to deal with the children in the care, because we recognize that this is an extremely difficult situation. And so the more you can train your staff to deal with this situation, the better the outcome will be. And then family engagement. Mercedes mentioned that HB 1312 requires updating of the emergency contact information, and that's vitally important in case somebody is unable to pick up their child due to immigration enforcement action. We can go to the next slide. Okay. If immigration enforcement agents contact a daycare or come to a facility, right, we want you to refer to your written plan of action, which is why we provided you the policy template, which we hope is a good start. It's important to identify what information is being requested and ask for the documents to support that request. Take time to consult with your supervisor and your legal counsel. And consider client confidentiality. If disclosure is required, it's important to only disclose what is specifically being requested. So a lot of times, as Joanna went over, daycare centers have a lot of PII or PHI. If that is not requested, it is important not to disclose that information, because then we have breached a child or relative's confidentiality that we did not need to breach. And again, just remember, no disclosure without a court order signed by a judge or a parental consent. We can go to the next slide. And I will hand this back to Joanna.
Okay, so having taken all of the precautions and done all of the planning, part of that, as we've talked about, is preparing for the possibility that alternative care would be needed for a child. We have seen in some circumstances, a parent being detained while a child is at school or is at daycare. And so the absolute key to being prepared for this is encouraging families to create an emergency plan. This can be, should be identifying an alternate caregiver, communicating with the alternate caregiver, making sure that they know all of the important phone numbers that they may be contacted by. For example, if your aunt is the emergency caregiver, your aunt should have the daycare's phone number in their phone to make sure that it's not, silenced because it's an unknown caller. These are the kind of things that might be in the template emergency family plan that we have linked to in the non-regulatory guidance. They can walk a family through all of these sort of nooks and crannies of details that they can plan ahead for. At the very least, a family needs to have updated emergency contacts. And I would suggest very strongly that if a child is of age where they can understand, while scary and nobody wants to talk about this, better to communicate the plan to the child so that they are aware of what's going to happen. We know they're feeling fear as it is. So having a plan, is what we can do. And that obviously requires actively communicating with families and regularly communicating with families, because these things can change very quickly. If your family member is the backup and there's an illness in the family, that's something that needs to be addressed because we want to be prepared at any moment. And we would also suggest, families can consult with an attorney about guardianship options. It can be very helpful to designate a short-term guardian, and these are things that can be done, without great legal effort, but the documentation can still be important and useful for a family to have. Next slide, please. So again, I think of this sort of in two branches. There's preparedness for the families to take and preparedness planning for the centers to take. Every center is required to have, pickup authorization on file. It's important that the family's emergency plan match that pickup authorization. You don't want to have a conflict there in the event of a crisis. When DCFS has gotten many questions, understandably, about what happens if there is no care plan, what happens if a parent is detained. And what I would say is, in that event, when there's no care plan in place, DCFS has created a unique space for these types of situations where we are really leaning in to help find family members and fictive kin who can care for a child if their parent becomes unable. Next slide, please. It is important to understand, and may surprise people to know, that DCFS is not automatically notified if a parent or a guardian is detained. In fact, DCFS won't know unless somebody calls. If somebody calls, what DCFS is trained to respond to, and at this time, is to work with the family to help identify a safe care plan, and a relative or a backup caregiver who can step in. If in the very last resort, there is no safe place for a child to go, there is an option for DCFS to work with court and to take custody for a non-abuse or neglect reason. It's called a dependency reason. And that should not happen. Ideally, that will not happen. It has not happened, but that is sort of a legal pathway that exists for if a child is entirely unaccompanied and has no safe place to go. So the takeaway there is, of course, this beautiful graphic. So this is the second resource that I wanted to point out. This is a one-pager that is also on the website. DCFS support for families facing immigration challenges. And the point of this document is to sort of take someone who's not familiar with the child welfare system through different scenarios and identify how and when DCFS can help. So it ranges from, if a youth is in the care and custody of their parent, DCFS has no involvement. If a caregiver is detained, how they can help. If there's no safe place to go, suggests a call to the DCFS hotline and sort of goes through those scenarios. So this is also a really excellent one-page document that anyone can have, but it's particularly helpful for daycare centers, I think, and people who are facing questions about what might happen if I'm not able to pick up my child. Next slide, please. So I think Jennifer touched on most of these, but in the non-regulatory guidance at the back end of it, as well as the daycare policy template, there are multiple links for English, Spanish, and other languages about Know Your Rights toolkits, the Illinois immigrationinfo.org, which is just an outstanding resource with templates for planning, all sorts of information. Additionally, the legal documents that we link to, which helps just give people a visual of, if you've never seen a subpoena before, this is what it looks like. And then finally, the DCFS Advocacy Office is a helpline for the general public to answer questions and help direct families to resources. So I would encourage anyone with questions about this material to reach out to the DCFS Advocacy Office. And please know that we are your partner in this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you both, Jennifer and Joanna, for walking us through that overview. We're now going to transition to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. And so thank you to everyone who's already submitted questions. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can. I'd also like to acknowledge the additional representatives from the Department of Children and Family Services who are also here to respond to questions, including Edie Washington, Associate Deputy Director, Division of Daycare Licensing, and Anika Todd, Deputy Director, Office of Licensing. So thank you so much to all the experts on today's call to help answer some of these questions. So I'll kick us off with the first question, and it's around the different types of settings that this law applies to. And so as we think about home-based daycare providers and child care centers at college campuses, are they required to have a written policy in place?
So, Rosario, I will take that question. Let me make sure I understand, or let me say this. This bill, HB 1312, only requires that licensed daycare centers have a written policy. However, I think we would strongly recommend that any daycare provider have a written policy, just because in that moment, it's really hard to, in the moment that immigration enforcement comes, it's going to be really hard to go through the steps and think through it if you do not have a written policy. But this bill only requires it's for licensed daycare centers.
Thank you, Jennifer. And that does answer the question. So thank you for responding. And so on that note, how often should providers update or confirm the authorized pickup designee? Should it be monthly, quarterly? Is there any, common best practice that you all recommend?
I think that's a great question. I will jump in here, but then I might kick it over to DCFS licensing. I believe the bill recommends twice a year. So I think that's what's required, but I will kick it over to maybe Edie if she can recommend best practices.
So I would say best practice would be as it changes, as you know that your emergency contact list has adjusted, or if those people that you originally had on there are going to be out on vacation or out of town, then you want to adjust and amend that list so that the child care facility is always aware and you have that continuation of a list to support your child and family.
Yes, and I would second that what Edie said, because again, we want the most current information available, because as we just stated, in that moment, it is very useful and helpful to have that right there versus seeking that. So I agree with what Edie just presented.
Thank you both. And on the topic of training, we know that this webinar has been super helpful in sharing the resources that both state agency partners have created. You all have put together some great resources in sharing that today. Is there an opportunity that you all are thinking about of any additional training? I know on the advocate side, we're thinking about doing a second webinar to talk more about best practices and really dive deep on like some of what the providers in our network have been doing to respond to these heightened immigration enforcement efforts. But wondering if there's any additional training that might be coming down the line.
I can speak for IDEC. I don't know that we have any planned at this time, but we want to be responsive to providers and make sure that they have the correct tools in place to be able to effectively, follow the statute and rules and to give the best care for children that's possible. I don't know. I will pass it to DCFS to see if they have any upcoming trainings.
So at this time, we do not have any upcoming training scheduled for this. We will try to support the providers during each and every visit and or as they request support to the best of our abilities, but we don't have a set training schedule set.
Okay, thank you. And is it fair to say that any upcoming opportunities will be posted on your website? I know that some of the resources have already been posted there, but is it okay to refer folks to those websites?
Yes, I think that's a
Okay.
great resource. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And I'm seeing, going back to the settings and the centers, are classrooms allowed to be designated private spaces? They have, some centers have classrooms that are half doors, so the entire top is open and it's half wall with a door to enter. So, I'm guessing like what is the procedures around designated private spaces within classrooms?
That is a great question. I tag in Joanna to help me answer that a little bit. It's not defined in the statute, but generally, like private daycare centers are private businesses. So I think you could designate spaces within a private business as a private space. Joanna, I'm going to tag you in. I am also, apologies, going to have to hop off early. There is Shante Blankenship, Director of Quality and Safety, is also on here or was on here from IDEC. If there are any more IDEC specific questions, but I will kick it over to DCFS to help answer that. And I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us.
Hi, yeah, I can, this is Joanna from DCFS. I can just, I second what Jennifer said, and again, it's not clearly defined in the statute, but because they're private centers, I think there's, some flexibility to designate that space. I've never seen any requirement that requires a certain number of walls or height of walls regarding a space, or that there be a door or anything like that.
Yeah, in regards to private space. That's
Yes.
what you're referring to, right, Joanna?
Yes, I am referring to designation of private space.
Okay, because I'm going to say like the center rules do have height and walls.
Yes, no, I'm not speaking to that. Sorry, Edie.
Okay, that's okay. So yeah, I'm going to say the facility gets to, because there's no specifics in the law, the facility can determine and designate what they consider to be a private space. Kind of similar to, they have sectioned off spaces for when kids are sick, whether they want that private space to be an office or this one room that's not being utilized. They get to determine what that private space is and document that so everyone is aware that that's the private space that has been identified in their plan.
Thank you both for that. And we have many, many questions coming in. One of the other questions that we received is, does a court order supersede parental consent for release of information?
So a court order that's signed by a judge, if it's, specific to that information and it's assuming it's a valid court order, then yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. And how are centers being checked for compliance? What are DCLRs looking for? And I should spell out the acronym, but the daycare licensing reps, what are they looking for to ensure that providers are in compliance?
So I would say what they should be looking at just is one, to ensure that they are following the law that is now in effect. And so therefore they need to monitor to ensure that facilities are doing it and are in the process of establishing this plan and putting something in place. They should be reviewing the plans to ensure that it meets the requirements of what's being asked. Now, we can't determine if it's going to be sufficient or not because it's based upon each person's facility and how they operate. But they need to check it for the content to ensure that they are meeting the requirements of the law.
Thank you, Edie. And we know that, it was mentioned earlier how we can't control what federal immigration officers are doing. And in some ways, we've already seen the negative effects in our communities regarding how they're carrying out enforcement. But wondering if you can share any thoughts on, around forced entry and how providers can respond in situations around forced entry where they may have these practices in place, they have a written policy in place, but we also know that the actions carried out by immigration enforcement may or may not follow what's in the guidance.
I can address that briefly, and I shouldn't lead with this, but I will say I don't have a fabulous answer. That's something that has come up every time that we've talked to people about it, and it's a very obvious concern. And, particularly with some of the events we saw in the fall with, officers barging in. ICE is also required to follow the law. And so to the extent that they don't, our advice to providers is to be safe and to maintain safety of any children in your care. If possible, all of the things that you hear sort of in the public discourse apply. If possible, record, the event. But, we absolutely would say, do not ever get in the way of an officer. Do not ever try and bar someone from coming in physically. Just maintaining safety at that point, I would say is the most important thing.
Joanna, thank you so much for that answer. And I would also like to add, at the beginning of today's conversation, we were joined by our CEO, Linda Tortolero, who serves on the Illinois Accountability Commission, and they are also collecting a public record of any conduct of federal agents. And so I would also encourage folks to visit the Illinois Accountability Commission website to submit any forms there or stories that's been happening. And there's been a couple of hearings, but just to start collecting that information, I think is great too. And I think we have time for one more question before we start wrapping things up with the resources that we have through our partners here who have put together some toolkits as well, and we'll be sharing those. But I will make time for one more question, and there are many coming in, so we appreciate everyone who has submitted them. Are there any recommendations for policies in classroom when ICE is on site, like shutting blinds, is just an example? I guess around like best practices when it comes to like classroom management. I'm not sure if you can speak to that. I know that in the legislation it doesn't lay it out specifically around those, but wondering if there's anything you'd like to add.
I don't have anything to add. Like you said, that's a pretty hard question to answer, as well as the temperament of some of the actions. I wouldn't want to suggest anyone jump and move and close a blind or do this and that, just because again of the temperament. And we wouldn't want to make any suggestions that will put someone in harm's way. Again, I can't harp enough with the temperament that's going on. So I don't have any suggestions as it pertains to that. closing the blinds or doing this or making any sudden movements.
Okay. And sorry, just one last question. I promise it's the last one. If it is a child care center that receives federal funding, such as Head Start, that helps to pay for space in any way, does that mean it's still private or still considered private?
So you can receive federal funding and still be a private space.
Okay. So thank you for answering that. And with that, I mean, I know there are so many unanswered questions. We will try to do some follow-up in the email that's going to be sent out within the next week or so. But I just really want to thank all the representatives from our state agency partners for their expertise and coming on here to answer questions, as well as the Department of Early Childhood and our partners Start Early, Illinois Action for Children, We the Village Coalition, for their partnership through this webinar. So I'm going to kick it over to Mercedes Mondragon to walk us through some of the resources and toolkits that they've put together to help providers carry out some of this implementation piece.
Yeah, we can move to the next slide. Thanks, Rosario. And again, thank you so much to our agency partners for being able to co-present with us and also for answering all of these difficult questions. We just wanted to quickly highlight some toolkit resources. So you'll see the QR codes here. There was a toolkit resource created by the Together for Head Start campaign from Start Early. That's on the left, and on the right, you'll see one from the We the Village Coalition. These toolkits are really full of resources, templates, model policies. It's really meant to be step-by-step guidance for programs, whether for homes or for centers, to really help guide you through this legislation or what best practices look like as you try to navigate this uncertain future. So here are the QR codes, and then we can move to the next slide. And then again, just thank you so much for being here, for your engagement, for your questions. We do have another upcoming webinar on March 19th in the evening at 6:30 p.m. We'll talk a little bit more about best practices for implementing HB 1312 and walk through the toolkit resources and any questions that folks may have. In the meantime, you're more than welcome to reach out. There are some emails that you'll see on your screen. Again, just thank you again for being here. We hope that you have left with a better understanding of some of the legal requirements and some of the best practices that you can use within your own center. Over the course of the next week, we will send out the recording along with the resources. But again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your partnership. All right. Have a great day, everyone.